Harlan County, Kentucky, October 1871. The cold came early that year. By the third week of October 1871, the ridgelines above Harlan County, Kentucky, were already dusted with frost that didn't melt by noon. The hardwood forests had turned amber and rust, and down in the valleys, families were splitting wood in a panic, stacking cords against the walls of their log cabins, measuring survival in board feet and BTUs, though they didn't use that word yet. They measured it in weeks. How long will this stack last? Will it be enough? On a limestone bluff called Shepherd's Ridge, a man named Caleb Drum was not splitting wood. He was digging. Neighbors who passed the ridge trail in those weeks would stop and stare. Some laughed outright. A few called down to him, offering advice, offering insults, sometimes both. Caleb was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had thought something through so many times it had become muscle memory. He didn't answer the calls from the trail. He kept digging. He was carving a home into the face of the limestone cliff, and most of the people who saw him at work were convinced he had lost his mind. By spring of 1872, when the worst winter in Harlan County memory had finally released its grip, those same neighbors would be standing at his door, not to mock him, but to measure, to count the firewood he had left, to put their hands against his walls and feel something they couldn't explain, warmth radiating from solid stone, hours after the fire had gone cold. This is the story of what Caleb Drum understood about heat and what everyone else had been getting wrong for generations. If you've ever wondered why old houses felt different from modern ones, why your grandfather's cabin held warmth in a way that a new build just doesn't, stay until the end of this video. The answer is carved into a limestone cliff in eastern Kentucky, and it's more elegant than anything you'll find in a hardware store today. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Every week, we bring you a real technique from history, the kind that worked when your life depended on it. Subscribe so you don't miss a single one. To understand why Caleb Drum did what he did, you first have to understand what everyone else in Harlan County was doing and why it was failing. The standard frontier cabin of the 1870s in the Appalachian region was a log structure. Saddle-notched white oak or chestnut logs, chinked with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal hair, topped with a split-wood shingle roof, and centered on a single stone fireplace. By the standards of the era, it was a proven design. Settlers had been building them for generations. It worked after a fashion, but working and working well are two different things. A well-built frontier cabin of that period, approximately 16 by 20 feet, roughly 320 square feet, required between 1 and 1.5 cords of wood per week to maintain livable temperatures during a hard Appalachian winter. That's between 128 and 192 cubic feet of split, seasoned hardwood every single week. A family that burned through 1.25 cords weekly from November through March needed close to 25 cords to survive the season. That's not a number you gather casually. It's months of labor, a significant portion of the year's work, and a constant anxiety that shadowed every cold morning. And even then, even with all that wood, the results were inconsistent. The core problem with a log cabin fireplace wasn't the fire itself. It was physics. A standard open hearth fireplace of the era operated at perhaps 10 to 15% thermal efficiency. The rest, up to 85% of the heat generated, went straight up the chimney as hot exhaust gas. What remained radiated outward, warming the air nearest the hearth, but air is a poor thermal medium. The moment you stopped feeding the fire, the temperature dropped. Fast. Oral accounts from Harlan County settlers describe waking before dawn to ice on the inside of the windowsills and frost on the bed covers near the walls, even in cabins with fires that had burned low through the night. The walls were the other problem. Log walls, even well-chinked ones, have a low thermal mass. They absorb heat during the day, but they don't store it. They can't release it slowly through the night. By 2 a.m., the stored warmth is gone, and the wood structure, now colder than the air outside, actually begins to draw heat out of the room through conduction. Caleb Drum had lived this reality for 12 years. His first cabin, built in 1859, had burned through wood at a pace that left him anxious every February. His second, rebuilt in 1864 after a chimney fire took the first one, was better, but still not right. He kept notes, a practice unusual for the time, scratching observations into the back pages of a Bible. Local records held in the Harlan County Historical Archive include a reference to these notes, though the original document has not been preserved. One entry, reportedly from the winter of 1868, reads simply, "The fire heats the air. The air escapes. The stone must be the fire." It took him 3 more years to figure out what that meant. The limestone bluff at the southern face of Shepherd's Ridge rises approximately 30 feet, about 9 meters, above the valley floor. The stone there is dense Carboniferous limestone, the same formation that runs beneath much of eastern Kentucky, gray-white and fine-grained, with a compressive strength that local quarrymen of the period estimated at 8,000 to 10,000 pounds per square inch. It is, in other words, one of the most thermally stable natural materials available in that region of the country. Caleb chose his site with care. The bluff faces south-southeast. In the winter months, the low angle of the sun in the southern sky means that a south-facing rock face receives direct solar radiation for the maximum number of daylight hours, collecting and storing radiant heat in the stone itself, like a battery charged by the sun. This is not a modern concept. It is physics, and it works whether or not you have a name for it. What he excavated was not a cave in the raw sense. It was a chamber, roughly 18 feet wide, 22 feet deep, and 8 feet high at the interior peak, approximately 5.5 by 6.7 by 2.4 meters. He cut the floor level and smooth, then laid a dry stone foundation of flat limestone slabs, lifted 8 inches, 20 centimeters, above the raw earth, creating an air gap beneath the living floor. This gap served a dual purpose. It prevented ground moisture from wicking up into the floor, and it created a thermal buffer, a layer of still, insulating air that separated the cold earth from the habitable space above. The walls he left as raw limestone, not plastered, not framed. Bare stone, still connected to the living bluff behind them. The ceiling was the underside of the cliff itself, sealed along the edges with lime mortar mixed on-site from burned local limestone. The front face of the structure, the only exposed side, facing south, he framed with a timber wall and a heavy wooden door, with 2 small windows fitted with oiled paper initially, later with salvage glass. The fireplace he placed at the rear of the chamber, set directly into the living stone of the cliff. This positioning was deliberate and, to his neighbors, baffling. Every cabin fireplace they had ever seen was built into an exterior wall, so the chimney could run up the outside of the structure. Caleb's chimney ran up through the limestone, using a natural fissure he had found and widened, venting smoke through the top of the bluff. This meant the entire mass of the chimney, perhaps 12 to 15 feet of stone from firebox to vent, was embedded in rock that retained and re-radiated its heat. He also cut what he called a warming shelf, a horizontal ledge of stone, 14 inches deep, 35 centimeters, running the full width of the rear wall at shoulder height, positioned directly above the firebox opening. This shelf acted as a radiant panel. As hot gases rose from the fire, they passed across the underside of the shelf before entering the flue, heating the stone and turning it into a second radiating surface that threw warmth into the room from above, not just from the front of the fire. The total thermal mass of the structure, the limestone walls, rear cliff face, floor slabs, and chimney stack, was later estimated by a Harlan County stonemason in an 1879 county survey as approximately 18 to 22 tons of dense stone. 18 tons of rock connected to the thermal body of 30-foot bluff, heated by both sun and fire, releasing that stored energy slowly, evenly, through the coldest hours of the night. Caleb Drum spent 11 weeks completing the excavation and construction. He worked mostly alone. His wife, Adeline, and their 3 children moved in on November 14, 1871. The neighbors thought it was the strangest thing they had ever seen. Word travels fast in a small community, and Harlan County in 1871 was a close-knit place where reputation meant something, where the judgment of experienced men carried real weight, the kind of weight that could make or break a family standing. The first public critic of Caleb Drum's cave dwelling was a man named Rufus Pickard. Pickard was the most respected builder in the county, a man who had constructed the Harlan Courthouse chimney stack in 1867 and whose stone and mortar work was referenced approvingly in the county record as sound and lasting. He was 62 years old, white-bearded, and accustomed to being the final word on matters of construction. He walked up to Shepherd's Ridge in early November, not long after Caleb's family had moved in. He stood outside the timber-front wall for a long time, saying nothing. Then he looked at the neighbor who had brought him, and he said, slowly and without cruelty, but with the full weight of his authority behind every word, "That's not a home. That's a grave with a chimney." It was a simple sentence. It traveled the county in days. Men repeated it at the feed store, at the mill, over split-rail fences. Women mentioned it quietly to each other. Children said it to Caleb's children, who came home from the ridge trail with red faces and tight mouths and didn't repeat what they'd heard. Pickard's objections were not entirely without basis, to be fair. His concern about moisture was legitimate. Limestone formations can weep groundwater under certain conditions, and a poorly selected site could produce a damp, cold, unhealthy interior. His concern about ventilation was real. A chamber with limited fresh air exchange could allow carbon monoxide to accumulate to dangerous levels. His concern about structural stability, while less warranted given the density of the stone Caleb had chosen, was not unreasonable from the perspective of a man who had seen poorly built dugouts collapse. But Pickard had not been inside. He had not felt the walls. He had not noticed the careful slope Caleb had cut into the floor to channel any moisture toward a drain at the front threshold. He had not examined the secondary vent Caleb had bored near the ceiling of the chamber, a small horizontal tunnel, 6 inches in diameter, 15 centimeters, aimed at the prevailing west wind, creating a passive cross-draft that refreshed the air without opening the main door. And Rufus Pickard had not done the arithmetic on thermal mass. Other critics were less measured than Pickard. A timber supplier from the valley named Gideon Marsh, who stood to lose a steady customer if Caleb's wood consumption dropped significantly, was blunter. Any man who houses his family in a hole in the ground is no better than a groundhog. And groundhogs freeze, too. There was laughter. There was always laughter. Adeline Drum reportedly heard the groundhog comment at the general store in town. She bought her flour, she nodded politely, and she walked back up Shepherd's Ridge without saying a word. Oral tradition in the Drum family, passed down to county historian records in the 1930s, holds that she told Caleb that evening, "Let them laugh." The stone remembers warmth longer than they do. It was a harder autumn for the Drum children than their parents had planned. But Caleb did not modify the design. He trusted the stone, and that trust was about to be tested in a way that no one, not even Caleb, had fully anticipated. Stay with me, because the number that came out of that winter is the number that shut Rufus Pickard up for good. Subscribe now if you haven't, because next week we're looking at another technique that kept frontier families alive with half the resources everyone else used. You don't want to miss it. January 1872 came in like a verdict. The cold front that settled over eastern Kentucky in the first week of the new year was, by any measure available to the people living through it, extraordinary. Oral accounts gathered by county historians in the decades following described temperatures dropping to between 5 and 10 degrees Fahrenheit, approximately -15 to -12 degrees Celsius, and staying there, not for a day, not for 2, but for 19 consecutive days. Wind came off the ridges from the northwest in long, cutting sheets. Snow fell and compacted and froze to a crust that broke underfoot like glass. In the cabins of Harlan County Valley, families huddled. They burned wood at a pace that frightened them. Standard log cabin construction, which had seemed adequate in October and merely challenging in November, was now proving itself brutally inadequate in January. Families that had stacked what they thought was a generous supply, 18-20 cords, were watching it disappear at a rate of nearly 2 cords a week. Some were already sending their older children into the frozen woodlet at first light, splitting green wood that wouldn't burn cleanly, filling their cabins with smoke that stung eyes and coated lungs. Rufus Pickard's own home, a well-built, two-room log cabin with a proper exterior chimney of his own construction, reportedly burned through 2 full cords in a single 7-day stretch during the coldest week. His son, who lived in a neighboring cabin and kept a written account of that winter, noted that their indoor temperature could not be kept above 42 degrees Fahrenheit, 5.5 degrees Celsius in the early morning hours, despite a fire kept burning through the night. On Shepherd's Ridge, something different was happening. Caleb Drum was feeding his fire once in the morning and once in the evening. 2 sessions of roughly 2 hours each, burning approximately a quarter cord of wood per week, a fraction, less than 1/8, of what Pickard's cabin required. The fire he built was not large. It didn't need to be. The limestone walls had been absorbing heat since November. By January, they were saturated with stored thermal energy, 18 to 22 tons of dense stone, slowly releasing warmth into the insulated chamber at a rate that was nearly independent of whether the fire was currently burning. A neighbor named Amos Whitley, whose cabin sat in the valley below Shepherd's Ridge, climbed up on the 14th day of the freeze to check on the Drum family. Partly out of genuine concern, partly, his own diary suggests, out of curiosity. He had expected to find them cold. He brought an extra blanket. What he found instead, he recorded in that diary that evening. The entry, preserved in the Harlan County Historical Collection, reads, "Arrived at Drum's place mid-morning. Temperature outside, not above 8 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 13 degrees C. Inside the cave, my coat felt unnecessary within a minute of entering. The walls were warm to the touch, not hot, warm like a stone that's been sitting in afternoon sun. Caleb told me the fire had last burned the previous evening. I did not believe him until he showed me the ash. The family was at breakfast. The children were not in coats." Whitley measured the interior temperature using a mercury thermometer he had brought from his own home. He recorded 61 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius. Outside, the air stood at 8 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 13 degrees Celsius. The difference was 53 degrees Fahrenheit, with no active fire. Over the remaining days of the cold snap, Whitley visited 3 times more and took additional readings. The interior of Caleb Drum's cave dwelling never dropped below 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees Celsius during the 19-day freeze, including the mornings when the fire had been cold for 12 hours or more. The neighboring log cabins, burning twice to 4 times the wood, averaged between 38 and 44 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 to 7 degrees Celsius, in the early morning hours. Caleb Drum consumed approximately 3.5 cords of wood for the entire winter of 1871 to 1872. His nearest neighbor, in a comparable-sized log cabin, consumed between 22 and 24 cords. The stone had remembered warmth, exactly as Adeline had said it would. The freeze broke on the 21st of January. The temperature climbed back above freezing overnight, and by morning the valley was dripping. Icicles cracking off eave boards, snow sliding off cabin roofs in wet slabs, the creek at the base of Shepherd's Ridge running fast and dark with meltwater. People came outside blinking, counting their wood stacks, checking their livestock, taking stock of what the 19 days had cost them. It had cost some of them everything they had to spare. Amos Whitley didn't wait long. Within 2 days of the thaw, he had walked back up to Shepherd's Ridge, this time not alone. He brought his brother-in-law, a man named Court Ewell, who had lost most of his winter wood supply to the freeze and was already anxious about February. Whitley didn't say much on the trail up. He just let Court put his hand against the limestone wall of Caleb Drum's front chamber and feel it for himself. Court Ewell stood there for a long moment. "It's warm," he said. "It's been warm," Whitley answered. "All month." That was the beginning. What followed was not a dramatic public reversal. No town meeting, no formal vindication, no moment where Rufus Pickard climbed the ridge and shook Caleb's hand in front of a crowd. That's not how things worked in Harlan County. Change came quietly, practically, the way it always does in communities where survival is the primary argument. People adapted not because they were convinced by theory, but because they were convinced by the wood stack. Or rather, by the size of Caleb Drum's wood stack at the end of February compared to their own. By the spring of 1872, Caleb had answered questions from at least 11 different families who made the climb to Shepherd's Ridge. He showed them the construction without reservation: the floor gap, the rear set firebox, the warming shelf, the passive vent. He explained what he had observed and what he believed, careful to frame it as observation rather than expertise. Local accounts suggest he was a methodical, patient teacher, the kind of man who answered the same question 4 times without irritation. The first family to attempt a similar structure was the Bewley family, who owned land on the eastern face of the same ridge. Hiram Bewley, a farmer and part-time quarryman, began excavating in May of 1872 with Caleb's guidance. His chamber was smaller, 14 by 18 feet, 4.3 by 5.5 meters, but followed the same principles: south-facing exposure, rear-set hearth embedded in the living stone, elevated floor, passive ventilation bore. The Bewley family moved in before the first frost of 1872. That winter, Hiram Bewley consumed 4.1 cords of wood from November through March. His previous log cabin, still standing on the valley flat below, had required 19 cords the season before. The numbers were not subtle. They were the kind of numbers that travel. By the autumn of 1873, 3 additional families on Shepherd's Ridge and the surrounding limestone bluffs had begun excavation of cave-style dwellings. A stonemason from Pineville, about 30 miles, 48 kilometers, to the southwest, reportedly visited Caleb's home in the summer of 1873 and returned to his own county with detailed notes. A county surveyor's record from 1875 references cave-cut winter dwellings of the drum pattern as a recognized construction type in the upland areas of Harlan County, a phrase that suggests the design had already been abstracted from its origin and given a name. By the late 1870s, oral history and scattered written records suggest that somewhere between 15 and 20 families in the broader Harlan County region had incorporated some version of Caleb Drum's principles into their dwellings. Not always full cave excavations, but partial earth sheltering, rear-set hearths, elevated floors, and the use of existing limestone outcroppings as thermal mass walls integrated into conventional cabin construction. The design had been adapted, simplified, localized, which is exactly how vernacular engineering spreads. Not through publications or proclamations, but through neighbors watching neighbors survive winters better. Rufus Pickard, the man who had called the cave a grave with a chimney, did not excavate a cave dwelling. He was 62 when the freeze hit and set in his methods. But his son, according to family accounts preserved in the county historical records, did incorporate a limestone thermal wall into the rear of his cabin during a renovation in 1874. Whether he acknowledged the source of the idea is not recorded. It probably didn't matter to Caleb Drum either way. What Caleb Drum had understood, and what Rufus Pickard and Gideon Marsh and the Laughing Man at the feed store had missed, was a principle so fundamental it borders on obvious once you see it. Heat is not a fire. Fire is the input. Heat is what you store. A fireplace that burns efficiently but loses its warmth the moment the fire goes cold is not a heating system. It's a performance. It produces comfort while it runs and nothing else. The frontier cabin was, thermally speaking, entirely dependent on the continuous operation of its fire. Stop the fire, lose the heat. Simple, direct, and desperately inefficient. Limestone doesn't work that way. Dense stone absorbs thermal energy slowly and releases it slowly, a property physicists call thermal mass or thermal capacitance. A cubic foot of dense limestone holds roughly 28 BTUs per degree Fahrenheit of temperature change. Caleb's 20 tons of embedded stone, 40,000 pounds, represented a thermal reservoir of extraordinary capacity, heating it from 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius, to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 degrees Celsius, over the course of a full autumn of small fires stored enough energy to maintain a livable interior temperature for many hours beyond the last log's burn. The stone didn't just hold heat. It rationed it, releasing it at a rate governed by the temperature difference between the wall and the room air, slowing its release as the room warmed, accelerating slightly as the room cooled. A passive, self-regulating system built from nothing but the mountain itself. The south-facing orientation amplified the effect. On clear winter days, direct solar radiation striking the exposed limestone face of the bluff could raise the surface temperature of the stone by 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 to 17 degrees Celsius, above the ambient air temperature, pre-warming the thermal mass before the evening fire even began. The cliff was, in effect, a solar collector that had been in operation since long before Caleb Drum was born. He simply built his home inside it. There's a tendency, when we look back at the past, to measure it by what it lacked. No insulation ratings, no HVAC, no double pane glass. And by those measures, the frontier home was primitive, limited, cold. But that framing mistakes the tool for the principle. Caleb Drum didn't have our 38 wall insulation. He had 30 feet of solid limestone. He didn't have a programmable thermostat. He had a south-facing cliff and a stone hearth that remembered every fire he'd ever built in it. The principle worked then. It works now. Passive solar design, earth-sheltered construction, thermal mass heating. These are not new ideas repackaged for a modern audience. They are old ideas, developed by necessity, proven by crisis, and then quietly forgotten when cheap lumber and cheap fuel made forgetting easy. Caleb Drum didn't forget. He dug instead. And on the coldest night of the coldest January in Harlan County memory, while his neighbors shivered and split frozen wood in the dark, his children slept warm under a mountain that had been storing the sun's heat since long before anyone in that valley had a name for what it was doing. That's the lesson. Not just survival, elegant survival. The kind that uses less, wastes nothing, and works harder the longer it runs. If this story made you think differently about heat, about old buildings, about what our ancestors actually understood, drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us, what's the coldest winter you've ever lived through? We read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Every week, we dig up another technique like this one. Real, practical, forgotten wisdom from the people who figured it out the hard way. You won't find this in a textbook, but you'll find it here. See you next week. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.